Hey there, Trailblazers. Welcome to Chapter 9. We're almost there. You have Chapter 9 to finish and Chapter 14, and then you'll be done with Management 265 Business Statistics for this semester. So in Chapters 7 and 8, we discussed how we could use a sample to estimate population parameters, whether that be a proportion or a sample statistic, a sample mean. So in Chapter 9, we're going to continue that conversation about statistical inference, and we're going to look at it from the standpoint of using that information to test hypotheses. So the first thing that I want you to do is pause the video and go to the beginning of Chapter 9 and read Statistics in Practice. I will catch up with you here in just a few minutes. Go ahead and read that and then play your video again. All right, so now that you have read through Statistics in Practice, you should have a general idea of what we're going to be covering in Chapter 9 with hypothesis testing. From that example, you could see that we were going to use the population parameters in sampling to determine whether we should reject the null hypothesis or do not reject the null hypothesis. I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail in the coming sections. This video is just the introduction. I do want you to take note here of the homework problems that you have for this chapter are right here. There are 12 homework problems. They follow these numbers within your textbooks. Most of these are at the end of the section. 1 through 10 are at the ends of the sections that I've put right here for you. And then the last two homework problems, number 51 and 57, mind you, these are in my MindTap, but if you go into your textbook, these are the questions that are at the end of the chapter. Question number 51 follows 9.3, and question number 57 follows 9.4. So let's jump into this. Right, so some things that I just want to touch base on before we jump into Chapter 9, things that you should already be familiar with. You should be familiar with the formulas that we use to compute z-scores, our sample mean minus our population mean, then divided by our standard error. There's our standard error, standard deviation divided by square root of our sample size. Our p-value, which is the probability value that we get for our z-score. For Excel, we use equals norm.dist. You put in your z-score, comma true. This, remember, is for a lower tail. When I say lower tail, I'm talking about this part right here, okay? So lower tail. And remember that if you're trying to figure out the probability in this part up here in this upper tail, then you need to do 1 minus your norm.dist. That should not be new to you at this point. Using Excel to compute your sample mean, it's just using your equals average, then you highlight your array. Using Excel to compute your sample size is just equals count, then open parenthesis, highlight your array, close parenthesis. Confidence intervals, formulas that we used in last chapter, your sample mean, plus or minus your z-score, which is multiplied by your standard error. Formulas we use when we're dealing with population mean for standard deviation known. We're going to cover that in 9.3. But the z-scores, you're going to use the sample mean. The t-values that we use for population mean when standard deviation is unknown. Again, we use sample mean for that, or your x-bar. And also population proportions. So what's going to be new to you for this section? Well, one thing that's going to be new for you is using what's known as a beta. Let me first go over what I'm talking about here. So familiarity should be your alpha level or your level of significance. You may recall if we're talking about a 95% confidence interval, your alpha value is 0.05. Another familiar confidence interval or significance level that we use for hypothesis testing is 0.01. That's when we're dealing with a 99% confidence interval. This one's associated with type 1 errors, which we will cover in section 9.2. This symbol right here is called a beta, and it is used type 2 errors, and it's simply the Greek beta symbol. Beta is 1 minus our alpha level. So we are going to cover that when we get to sections 9.2 and 9.3, 9.4.